your Unit 2 BPCC 101. So in the earlier unit, we had learned how to define psychology. And in this unit, which is your Unit 2, we will be discussing the nature and scope of psychology. So I hope you remember all the elements that we had learned in Unit 1 because they are going to help you navigate the Unit 2. So in this unit, we are primarily concerned with understanding the nature and scope of psychology. So what do I mean when I say nature and scope of psychology? So there are few objectives that we will be learning and will be our centered of our today's lesson. Okay, so one of the things that we'd like to learn in our today's class in terms of nature and scope would be to understand the relationship between psychology and other sciences. So one thing that we had learned is psychology is a versatile field. Correct? So we will be learning how it spreads in other fields and how we can navigate this better. It also allows us to explore different career options in the field of psychology, as well as where all psychology can be applied. Okay. Next is that understanding the early divisions of psychology. Now you might think that, okay, I am aware that there are different fields of psychology. So there is our industrial psychology, counseling psychology, clinical psychology. But what was the earlier division? That would be our focus for this lesson, understanding how it was divided in the earlier phase of the subject. Apart from that, we will learn about the different subfields in the field of psychology. So we will try to learn what all elements are there. We will try to learn what all areas you need to focus on, what all other aspects of psychology that are there. So when we say psychology is multidisciplinary, what all other fields are present? What all other disciplines are there? So that is something that we will be learning. And lastly, we will learn the different researches of psychology in Indian context. Now that is an important part. Why? Because we are trying to learn psychology within India, right? So we need to know the traditional and modern perspectives of Indian psychology. Along with that, we also need to know how this field emerged. All right, let's move ahead to the first aspect of this lesson. So when I say psychology, what do you think? In the last lesson we had learned in your Unit 1 that psychology is the study of behavior and mental processes. Correct. So that is what we had learned about psychology, and this particularly focuses on understanding different behaviors and mental processes, right? However, over the years, there have been several development in sciences, and sometimes psychology have related to more than one discipline, and that's why we say it is primarily a subject which is more multidisciplinary and more versatile in nature. Now let's understand this thing that when we talk about basic sciences, they're often divided into two approaches, that either it's going to be applied or it's going to be theoretical. However, this is not the nature with psychology. Psychology is something which does not have such a rigid structure, and rather it is spread out in terms of utilizing both theory, practice, and application. So as much as science is important, scientific theories are important in psychology, their application is of immense value. So without those applications, we don't have any use of theories, right? So you can see any theory of psychology that you learn, it can be applied to correct a behavior, can be applied to develop interventions. So we know that psychology as a field is not divided into two rigid structures. Hence, we state that no particular field of science, even psychology, can be isolated from other fields, right? This causes, since when I say that psychology is not divided with any other structure, what happens there? We know that this field of science is going to be connected with other fields, right? Because we apply it. Whatever we learn in psychology, it needs to be applied in order to make the best of the subject. Hence, this is why psychology is connected with several other fields. Now, let's get into a little more depth about the nature of psychology. So when I talk about the nature of psychology, we must understand that along with it comes its scope. So we know now that nature of psychology is not that simple. It is versatile. Psychology is present in every aspect, in every subject, no matter what, wherever a human is involved, psychology will be there, right? And we can see that a lot of animal studies also require psychology. So we know that nature of psychology is versatile and it is present everywhere. This nature promotes the scope of psychology. Okay. So when I say that I'm studying human behavior and mental processes, what do I mean by that? Where all can this be applied? What are the values of this subject that can be present in other fields as well? So the scope of psychology is often discussed with its relation to different fields. So there are various fields that come together and help understand the scope of psychology. Now, what do we mean by scope? What do we understand by scope? Because I know that this is a very common question that comes, that, what is the scope of psychology? What is the scope of this theory? Or what is the scope of this intervention? So what do we mean by scope? What do we understand? Let me explain this to you in this very simple term. Scope is how far a subject can go. Nature is what the subject is, what defines the subject. So our entire unit 1, we understood the nature of psychology, right? How it developed, what all elements are there. And when we talk about scope, what or how far can psychology go? That is what we learn in scope. Okay, so in scope, we are trying to learn how far the subject goes rather than where or what the subject is about. Okay, what, how, why we learn in nature, and far this depths, and as well as, let's say that how far can light go? That's the scope of light, right? That if I light a bulb here, I know it'll reach till the end of the room. Correct. So that's the scope of light. Similarly, if I am studying this subject psychology, in what all other connections can it be applied? Where else can it reach? Okay, so that is what we mean by scope of psychology. And it is important to understand because earlier, when during 1988, as you can also see on the slide, that Parmeswaram and Veena broadly classified psychology into general psychology and differential psychology. So general psychology would be the field or specifically an area of psychology that is focused with everything within the field. Okay. However, differential psychology primarily spoke about different divisions that are present in the field of psychology, different elements that are present in the field of psychology. It is important to understand that these two broad divisions further developed into branches of general psychology and applied psychology. So earlier, we would say that, when we talk about general psychology, it was just concerned with investigating general and similar behavior. That's about it. There were different processes that were involved in several other fields of psychology that were there, but it was primarily concerned with studying general and similar behavior. However, differential psychology was something that focused on concerns with observation, measurement, explanation. So all these aspects were there in your differential psychology, but it has changed over the period of time. And now these two psychology fields are further divided into other fields of psychology. Okay, hope that is clear. But we will learn the scope further ahead in our slides, and you will learn about to what extent psychology is present in our current world. Okay. I hope this much is clear, and I hope I'm not going too fast for you all. All right. So let's move ahead to early divisions of psychology. Now, when we talk about early divisions of psychology, psychology as a field was divided into two primary divisions. Okay. So we had our experimental and non-experiment. So when we started off with the field of psychology, there were only basic branches of our experiment and non-experiment. Now, what does it tell you? What do I mean by experiment and what do I mean by non-experiment? somewhere along the lines, yes, that experiment has something to do with research, and non-experiment probably we didn't use any kind of research or experiments. As you are right and you're in the right direction. But when we talk about experimental branch of psychology, it started with research studies in the field of your physiological learning and perception processes. So everything related to your biology, how people used to learn and how people used to make sense about the world, was focused in experimental psychology. You will also notice that a lot of researchers and a lot of former are people in the field of psychology who had made great advancements were all your physicians, psychiatrists. So they were all from the field of medicine. And then they had come to psychology and tried to combine medicine and philosophy and then learn these two subjects, right? So you can see that earlier in the field of experimental, or particularly experimental branch of psychology, psychologists tried to directly, understand the fundamental causes of behavior, and they tried to solve several practical problems that were faced. So they often engaged in research that was concerned with your fundamental processes of your cognition. These could be learning, memory, thinking, sensation, perception, your emotions, motivation. So all these elements were important in experimental field of psychology. So how do we understand this branch? How do I make it sense to me? Right? So experimental branch was just concerned with research of the fundamental processes. And then you know what are your fundamental processes. However, your non-experimental branch of psychology included different elements. These were your personality, your social psychology, and your developmental processes. So over the period, they all came into different fields and subfields of psychology, but earlier they were divided in the sense of experimental branch and non-experimental branch. So in non-experimental branch of psychology, you could notice there were subjects which had a lot to do with understanding, how the child grows, how development takes place, how we learn in the sense to do certain actions, how we learn how to behave in a society. So these were more applied psychology fields. So you will notice that experimental and non-experimental further gets divided in the future, and non-experimental branches often had applied fields which led to development of several theories. So you know now that a lot of this social psychology, we had several theories of motivation, we have several theories for emotions, right? So these were in context to the society, how the culture affected that, how this learning was impacted or imparted on the child who was trying to develop. Okay, so this is what the direction took. So I know now that non-experimental branch was concerned with fields that were more in the sense of applied, right? Applying the knowledge that was being created and studying elements such as personality, social, and developmental. Okay, so these were your elements of your non-experimental branch, but your experimental branch focused with what all aspects? Correct. Yes. So here you had research concerned with fundamental processes, the most basic processes, and they had a common approach. So you can notice that in non-experimental branch of psychology, they wanted to directly understand the impact of the subjects or of the elements. But in experimental branch, they were trying to indirectly solve the problems. So they were going to the root of all cause, and they were trying to understand how this process is further affecting the next process. Okay, I hope you're all with me up until now. A fun fact about experimental branch of psychology that I'll help you remember is, so how did psychology became a science? It was because Wilhelm Wundt established the first experimental lab of psychology in Leipzig, Germany. This is something that we learned in Unit 1 as well. Okay, so this is something that will help you remember that that's how experimental branch of psychology, what all things did Wundt focus on. Okay, so do some reading about that. So it'll help you further understand how the experimental branch came into picture and how it further elaborated, and a lot of medicinal individuals. As I said, that it came from people who were practitioners of medicine, and then they tried to solve the issues. Okay. We know that our favorite psychologist, a lot of us love him, Sigmund Freud, was also a psychiatrist and a physician, and then he came into psychology. Okay. All right. Let's move ahead to the subfields of psychology. Now, as I said earlier, that psychology is not a subject which just goes to an extent that, okay, these are the two divisions and this is the rigid factor about it. That we can only say psychology can be used in this, this, and this. No. Psychology is a field which has over 23 subfields. So this means you see how far the scope is, that there are so many options for you as a psychologist, as well as the theories that are in psychology. So 23 subfields of psychology. Now over here, I would like you to think whatever we study in the sense of scope. Okay, because every subfield of psychology is kind of a scope for psychology. That this subfield emerged. Why? Because there was a need, right? And that's why it is a scope of psychology. Okay. So we know that these have increased the scope of psychology in various sectors. So when these small subfields that came into picture, they further increased the need for psychologists and their expertise. Okay. Now understand the implication of psychology had again led to. Now what is implication over here? The applications that come from it. Okay. So the applications that come from psychology had further led to emergence of other fields. Now, it didn't happen that, okay, there was a need in clinical sector, so clinical psychology came. Yes, that is true. But when people saw that psychology can be applied in consumer behavior and social advertising, consumer psychology came in place. Right. So this is how it happened. Because of the application of psychology, a completely new field emerged. All right. Next was that primarily, the field of psychology is applicable to almost every field which requires human, as I said earlier, because psychology is concerned with human processes, right? Human behavior. And since we live in a society where most of the tasks and actions are performed by humans, this becomes of immense importance that the field is that varied, that versatile. Okay. Now we will learn what are the different subfields of psychology and what is their applications. So as you can see over here, we have 23 subfields. So if this wheel helps you understand what all are there. So we can see there is biopsychology, there is sports psychology, environmental psychology, military psychology, forensic psychology, medical psychology, industrial organizational psychology. Then we have our ergonomics, we have educational psychology, counseling psychology, consumer psychology, community psychology, clinical psychology, social psychology. And further ahead, you can notice we have personality psychology, learning psychology, gender psychology, experimental psychology, cultural psychology, comparative, cognitive, and physiological psychology. Lastly, we also have psychology of sensation and perception. So what does this help you understand is, what does this give you a direction towards? That you as a psychologist are going to have a lot of options, a lot of fields that you can check. So you will have to also choose which field suits you best. Now that becomes slightly difficult, right? That yes, since there is such a wide scope and there is such wide applications, choosing a field that suits you best is even a more difficult task. Yes. But these are all the fields that are there. Now let's try to understand each field of psychology slightly in detail. Okay, so when we talk about biopsychology, this is a field that deals with biological basis of behavior. So over here, you would be concerned with how your biology, how someone's genes, their hereditary, the brain, the hormones affect behavior and mental processes. Okay, so over here, the primarily belief is that all behavior occurs through bodily process. So whatever action is being done done, it is occurring through bodily processes. And over here, we try to understand that brain is the most crucial organ that plays a lot of functions that require coordination, and all your fundamental functions of complex behavior occur in brain. Okay. Apart from that, genetics is also an important element in the field of biopsychology. Why? Because genes are believed to be some causes of evolutionary behavior. Like anger is considered to be a evolutionary emotion that had been given to us through hereditary, right? So these are all the elements that are important. Apart from that, focus on different hormones secreted by endocrine glands have also shown to play an important role in behavior. So these all include your emotional behavior, temperament. All right. So we know now that behavior also has psychological or biopsychological basis, right? So all your biology, all these elements kind of impact your behavior and mental processes. Okay, a lot of diseases that cause neurodegeneration or neurocognitive impairment also have biological basis. And this is why it is important to learn biopsychology. Okay. Moving ahead, next, we have the field of cognitive psychology. Now, cognitive psychology is one of the fields which is primarily concerned with understanding human information processing abilities. So the focus is on how you take in information, how you process it, and what it leads to. So the belief is that all behavior or most of the behavior has cognitive basis. And how do we understand these cognitive bases? What is the way to go about it? So the best way to understand these cognitive bases is through cognitive psychology. So understanding how the function of thinking occurs, how problem solving takes place, how do you make decisions, what is the role of language, reasoning, memory. All these elements are a part of cognitive psychology. So anything that requires human information processing is, or any processing ability that deals with cognitive psychology. So all your theories of memory, models of problem solving, your thinking, how thinking happens, what are the bases of thinking, everything is learned over here. Okay, so that's what cognitive psychology deals with. Moving ahead, next, comparative psychology. Now, understand comparative psychology in a sense where you are trying to compare behaviors of different species. Okay, so what happens over here is you understand the behavior of animal or different species, and then you try to apply it to the human population. Now, a famous example is that researchers would try to understand how queen bee directs the worker bees, how she controls, how she makes sure that everyone is working. And this information can further be applied in industrial psychology to understand what is the crucial or important elements of leadership. So that's where our comparative psychology comes in place. So comparing behavior and applying it in the human processes. Okay. Moving ahead, next we have cultural psychology. So cultural psychology is primarily, all of us belong from different cultures, different ethnic groups, and different communities. Now, a behavior that is common in India might not be that common in United States. Now, what could that be? Let me give you a very basic example. A behavior like in India, the cultural norm is that children are supposed to live with their parents. But in United States, children often leave their parents' house by the time they turn 17 or 18. But this is not something which is applicable in India. So this is what cultural psychology is concerned with. So it tries to understand how different cultures, subcultures, and ethnic groups affect our behavior. So few things that often happen is the cross-cultural research. So it could be understanding how child rearing, bringing up a child or parenting is different in traditional India versus modern India, rural India and urban India, or how it is different in certain, we can say, minority groups in comparison to majority groups or majority communities. Right? So this is what cultural psychology is concerned with. Okay. Moving ahead, next we have experimental psychology. So when I talk about experimental psychology, this is primarily concerned with, and it often takes in record of the experimental processes. So an experimental psychologist, what would they do? They will often try to study different psychological process, such as your perception, learning, and motivation through a research method which requires controlled experiments. Okay, so you might remember one of the famous experiments in the field of psychology. Does anybody know that? So it's a behavioral experiment of Bobo doll, right? So this particular experiment is one of the famous experiments, and it was also criticized a little. So in the sense where they had put two control groups, one was an experimental group and one was a control group, and they had shown aggressive videos of adults violating or doing something to the Bobo doll in sense of hitting it, punching it. Bobo doll, you know all what Bobo doll is, right? It's that inflatable doll often, and it's an average height of a human, right? So they were the children also enacted the same behavior. So this kind of study tried to learn how behavior learning takes place or how modeling happens in children, something that we will discuss and learn in our future lessons. That is what experimental psychology is. So it focuses mainly on experiments and understanding psychological processes through experiments. Okay. All right. Next we have is gender psychology. Now, gender psychology is an interesting field of psychology because it tries to understand the role and influences of gender on basis of researches that are either on males or females. Now, it has tried to evolve and include other gender fluid aspects as well. So it tries to analyze the acquisition of gender identity, the role of gender in life. We know that if I am a man or if I'm a woman, my life trajectory or my developmental trajectory would be a little different. Correct? It's not going to be same. So if you have a brother or a sister, you can relate that their developmental trajectory in terms of their interaction with the society as well as your parents has been different, right? So try to notice these small nuances and understand how the role of gender influences different behaviors, right? So women behave differently in certain settings, men behave differently, even the interactions are different. Apart from interaction, interpersonal relationships are also quite different when we talk about gender. Okay, so this is what gender psychology is concerned with. Next, we have learning psychology. Now, this is another interesting subfield of psychology where the focus is on studying how and why learning occurs. Like, why do you learn or how do you learn, right? Learning could be anything. This doesn't just mean any of your lessons or any of your, chapters that you're trying to remember, but it is also concerned with different elements, right? You learning a behavior, you learning how to walk, how to talk, and how children learn, how they have to keep their head straight, right? Sitting, different social behavior as well as different academic things are involved in this particular field of psychology. So over here, we try to develop theories of learning, and then they try to apply it to variety of human problems in order to improve the learning processes. So the basic feature would be understanding why and how learning occurs and how can we improve this further. Okay, so this is what learning psychology is concerned with. Next is personality psychology. Something that you all are aware about is how we are different from one another and why sometimes we say, oh, uska to character hi aisa hai, or we say, oh, this is he is like this only, right? So we say these things, correct, that iska temperament aisa hai, right? So this is what the field of personality psychology is concerned with, right? So the field of personality psychology tries to study personality traits and dynamics. Okay, so the psychologists often develop theories of personality and often test for assessing personality traits. Okay, so they also focus on identifying different disorders of personality and understanding how personality develops over a period of time, right? So a child has a temperament, an adult has a personality, but it is important to understand temperament also because it's a foundational basis for personality. Okay, so all these elements are studied in this field of psychology. So to understand that why all of us have different traits, why we all behave differently, you might see that you and your friend are very close, but you two are also opposite to one another. This is something that could happen. And the basic cause for this is often the personality. So this is what this field of psychology is concerned with. Moving ahead, next we have physiological psychology. So physiological psychology overlaps with the field of biopsychology, and it is concerned with investigating often the role of the biochemical changes. So we have a lot of neurotransmitters in our body. We have a lot of hormones in our body, a lot of chemicals in our body. So this is what the field is concerned with. So understanding how our biochemical changes within the nervous system and our other area of our body affect everything that we do, we feel or think. So it tries to understand the role of biochemical changes on behavior. Okay. Moving ahead, next we have sensation and perception psychology. So this field studies the sense organ and the processes of perception. Now what happens often is, how do you make sense of the world around you? So that is what this field is concerned with. So understanding why illusions happen, why, what is misperception, what is perception. They try to study the depth, movement, and individual differences in perception. So research in this field is primarily concerned with developing laws and principles related to perception and understanding that why sometimes you can see in one picture, you can see a lot of pictures, right? So that is an illusion. Why these things happen? Why are we prone to all this factor? Okay, this is something that you will also learn in your unit 3. So this is just an introduction. You can feel that that is what this field is concerned with. All right. Okay. Moving ahead, next we have social psychology. Now, social psychology, as I said earlier, now when we learned about cultural psychology is primarily concerned with different culture and ethnic groups. But social psychology is concerned with society as a whole. So it tries to understand the human social behavior, like how we interact in the society and why we behave the way we do, right? So if you often notice that if some accident happens on a road, there is a huge crowd, but often people are hesitant to help the other person, right? And there could be a lot of things that are going on in their mind, but one of the reasons is because of bystander effect. So when other people are standing next to us, we often feel shared responsibility that, okay, if I don't help them, somebody else will probably help. It's fine, right? This is the thought that comes. So this is what social psychology is primarily concerned about. How prejudice, friendship, aggression, conformity, how these attitudes are developed over time, why discrimination happens in the society. So we try to understand how we think about others and how we interact with others often is influenced by our society, right? It also tries to understand how we influence society. Okay, so this is what social psychology is concerned. Moving ahead, next we have clinical psychology. So clinical psychology is the field of psychology where a clinical psychologist primarily sits in a hospital, and they might also have a private practice or a clinic. They often provide services like diagnosis or psychotherapy, and often they give aid in terms of psychoeducational interventions, right? So in this field, you are primarily concerned with pathology, trying to understand the severe psychological disorders and emotional troubles that an individual faces. So it includes, researching more about depression, anxiety, schizophrenia. So trying to understand all these elements of clinical psychology. So anything that has been related with pathology mental illness or psychological disorder comes under clinical psychology. So a clinical psychologist also does assessments to diagnose these disorders. Their job is not just to research about it, but also to diagnose it, understand the causes of it, and treat the disorder. So this is the role of a clinical psychologist. Often a lot of us in the field of psychology, primarily a lot of future psychologists want to go in the field of clinical psychology because it is something which is, I would say, very fascinating, very in the field and observable. So you will notice, if you do get a chance, make sure that you go for clinical internships and rotations so you understand the depths of it, what all elements you would require as a clinical psychologist, and whether you want to go ahead or not. Okay, so this is something that is concerned with clinical psychology. I hope it's clear. Moving ahead, next we have community psychology. Now, community psychology is one of the fields that applies community-wide mental health through research, prevention, education, and consultation. Now, what do I mean by community-wide mental health? So over here, the treatment per se or the rehabilitation per se is concerned with helping the entire community, right? So community psychologists often apply psychology principles and whatever theories of psychology that are there to help solve social problems. Okay, so over here the focus is not just about improving the individual, but the focus is on improving the community where people are living. So often social problems in a community are resolved by a community psychologist. Now, these could be any problem. This could be related to something of a migrant issue. Maybe people who are migrating from one city to another city are having major struggles, right? So that is where a community psychologist would primarily take place. Community psychologists also work in terms of providing awareness of effective and health promoting child rearing practices. It also advises school systems on how to make their curricular meet the needs of community members. So every community, what is a community? Community is where you are living, right? It's a particular small section of society where people live, correct? So that is your community, and a community psychologist is concerned with devising change, social or systemic change that addresses the needs of the community, be the community be part of a larger society or a smaller society. Okay, so that is what community psychologists do. All right, moving ahead, next we have consumer psychology, something that we spoke about earlier, right? So when we talk about consumer psychology, this particular field is primarily concerned with understanding how things or products can be marketed in a way that they will sell. Okay, so this is a connection to social psychology, and the focus is primarily on applying psychological principle to consumer behavior. What would a consumer psychologist do in a company? Think about it. Let's say you're working in a shampoo industry, all right, and you're a consumer psychologist. What would you do? You would research the consumer behavior. You will try to understand how they do, what all elements are there in their behavior. Are they purchasing it? What can we do? How can we market our product? What advertisement we should do? How can we interact with our consumers to boost our sales? Okay, so that all is concerned with consumer psychology. Moving ahead, next, counseling psychology. So counseling psychology is, let's say, in a smaller version of psychotherapy. Okay, why a smaller version? Because over here there are a variety of problems. Understand that psychotherapy or therapy and counseling are two different things. Therapy or psychotherapy deals with psychological disorders, but counseling psychology deals with everyday issues. These could be personal problems that includes relationship issues, career choice issues, small emotional troubles such as temper tantrums, behavioral problem, be unable to concentrate on things, or unable to pay attention to things, or eating a lot, right? So all these things are something that are covered in counseling psychology. Counseling psychology can be brief, and a counseling psychologist can do it who has a master's degree in counseling, right? But clinical psychology or psychotherapy is only provided by an MPhil graduate or a clinical psychologist who has done a postgraduate diploma in the field of psychology. Hope that is okay. Okay. Moving ahead, next, we have our educational psychology. Now, the field of educational psychology is primarily concerned with devising different learning techniques and applying the knowledge of psychology or learning psychology in classroom. So here the focus is on increasing the efficiency of learning in school, making sure that classes are more interactive, making sure that children are engaged in learning, they want to learn, they want to attend classes. Okay, so these all things are focused in educational psychology. So you as an educational psychologist would probably work in terms of understanding or developing curriculums which are more holistic in nature, which kind of serves to every child's learning needs. Okay, so that is what education psychology is concerned with. Moving ahead, next we have ergonomics. Now, ergonomics is quite a new field and a relatively booming field. So over here, the focus is on connecting two things, which is engineering technologies to human behavior. So this field of psychology is applied in terms of office spaces, workspaces, or even any other working environment to ensure that employees have optimum level of performance. They are performing very well. The work quality, the productivity of employee is good. And the ergonomic psychologist or the psychologist who specializes in this field would be concerned with designing and managing the workplace environment in such a manner where the employees are motivated to work and want to do more. Okay, so this is what is concerned with ergonomics. All right. Let's move ahead to industrial organizational field of psychology. Now, you might think this is something similar to ergonomics, but no. In ergonomics, yes, the focus was on improving and optimizing the human work efficiency. In industrial organizational psychology, two other disciplines get together, psychology and management or organizational behavior, which is our OB. So over here, behavior concerning to workplace, such as your organization culture, your organization structure, motivation, job satisfaction, all these factors are taken into consideration. So an organizational psychologist often focuses on changing the work environment in such a way that, see, every organization would have different struggles. Okay, so the organizational psychologist would try to address those struggles in different way. All right, so here it could be in different settings, it will be in different ways. So it could be from selection to recruitment of employees. The correct employee should be selected for a job. If you are being hired, can you do the job or not? So you will have to take into notice that whether the employee is a perfect job fit for the organization. Performance appraisal, understanding who should be promoted next, understanding the extent to which leadership takes a role, increasing work motivation, productivity. All right, so all these things are concerned with industrial psychology. So this particular study focuses on the organizational behavior and the management of that behavior. Okay. Next is medical psychology. Now, medical psychology is not a common field in India. However, a lot of hospitals try to imply it, where you have, if you have heard the word of palliative care is something which is concerned with care of individuals with chronic illnesses or illnesses that cannot be cured. So this could be your cancer or other, genetic illnesses that cannot be treated further, or if treated, the chances of survival are very low. So in the field of medical psychology, psychology is applied to manage the medical problems. So an emotional impact of an illness, or let's say if the patient is not taking their medicines, so that is where a psychologist would come and help them. Okay, so all these elements are there. This field of psychology often overlaps with health psychology, but it is entirely somewhat different. Okay, because over here the focus is on making the lives of people with chronic illness better. Okay, palliative care is one such example. You can definitely, after the lesson, search it on the web and learn about it more. All right. Okay. Next, we have forensic psychology. So, if any one of you who have watched Mindhunter, or if you have watched any other crime scene episodes, there's always a criminal psychologist on board, right? If you're a fan of true crime, or if you have watched some series related to it, you would know that forensic psychology deals with the understanding the criminal side of psychology. So often it is a blend of psychology and law, and it involves assessment of individuals who have committed a crime or would might be there. Apart from that, there are professionally skilled behavior analysis, evaluation, assessment, and treatment. Okay, so over here the focus is on, you as a psychologist would often be involved in different settings, such as in schools which are in unsure, or let's say where criminal activity is high, so you often do threat assessments. You might be working in a prison or a courtroom serving as an expert witness. So all these are few things that you will be doing. So over here you get training in both law and criminal psychology, and hence you're a forensic psychologist. So you often focus on the criminal side of psychology, right? We often have questions when we read about a possible crime that has been committed, that why would somebody do that, what is different about them, right? So a person who's more curious in that direction often deals with this. Yes, lie detector tests are also a part of forensic psychology. All right. Moving ahead, next we have military psychology. Now, military psychology is often focused on helping individuals who serve in the military. So this would include your people who are in the armed forces, be it Air Force or be it any form of military service. If a person is placed inside the country or outside the country, so a psychologist often helps these individuals focus and deal with the trauma that occurs through that. Okay, so this field of psychology, you as a psychologist here would administer different psychological tools which will help armed forces to thrive better in stressful situation. So the discipline often deals on applying the psychological theories as well as principles to deal with the enemy forces. All right. So it often allows the psychologist as well as the people working in the armed forces to make their life better. So that is what the primary aim is over here, to strive for a work-life balance as well as to serve the armed forces. Okay. Next is environmental psychology. So environmental psychology is a primary discipline that aims at researching and solving environmental issues which can further enhance the living conditions of human. So it understands, or it tries to understand, the interaction of human with the environment and how our behavior is influenced. See, it is often said that if you are in a calm environment, you can learn better, right? If you're in a calm environment, you are able to remember things better. Your mood is good. Imagine when you are in nature to when you are in traffic, how your mood changes. If you're stuck in traffic for 1 hour, you will get so irritated, so aggressive. You can see people honking, people getting in arguments. But think about those 1 hour in nature. So what would you be more like? You'll be calm. You would be surrounded with fresh air. So these elements are something how our mood and behavior is affected by environment. That is what the field focuses on. The field also tries to modify the environment. You will notice that when a child is growing up, or in children's school, there are a lot of paintings on the wall. But in adult colleges, the walls are pretty white, right? Or the building is not that bright or that we filled with so much color. But that is very much present in the primary schools or nursery schools, you will see big whales, fishes. Why is that? Why do you think that happens? Yes, so when a child is growing up and their brain is developing, in earlier stages, try to make learning environment more interactive, more stimulating. That's why there are these things in a child's classroom. Okay. All right. So this is a work of environmental psychology. All right. Moving ahead next with the last field is our sports psychology. Sports psychology often tries to improve the performance of athletes. So over here, the focus is on studying the influence of psychology on sports, exercise, and physical activity. So it deals with different aspects. So you as a sports psychologist might work in the F1 races, or you might work in, cricket teams, football teams, to help enhance the level of motivation, to improve the performance and team spirit. So the feeling of, in any game that requires a team, let's say cricket or football, you as a sports psychologist would be concerned with what? Improving the team spirit, or improving the assessment or the performance of the team as a whole. Okay, so that is what you focus on in sports psychology. Applying the applications or the theories of psychology in sports, that is what we do in sports psychology. All right. Okay, so that was all about your different fields of psychology. I hope you'll remember them all, correct? Okay. So lastly, moving ahead to our last bit for our today's unit is our psychology in India. So this includes your traditional and modern psychology. Now, as we discussed earlier, psychology emerged as an independent stream from philosophy in the Western countries. Okay, and these Western ideas and principles had a major influence on psychology in India. Now, we know there are different elements of Indian psychology that are derived from Bhagavad Gita, Yoga Sutras, Vedas, and our epic literature. So the traditional field of psychology in India consists of philosophical and religious literature. So this also included a major aspect of religion, which is our Hinduism and Buddhism and Jainism. How the teachings in Bhagavad Gita allow you to reflect upon your actions as human. So Bhagavad Gita, this is what the basic idea of psychology in India was traditionally. Focus was on including Veda or Vedic learning in the lives of human to improve the behavior. So there are sins that are mentioned in Buddhism that you should avoid. In Jainism, there are ways of living. In Hinduism, we have our Bhagavad Gita, which tells us how to behave, what all actions you should do. There are quite a lot of phrases in terms of handling defeat, failure, right? Apart from that, there was also an importance of epic literature, which is our Mahabharata, Ramayana, and how the behavior of these individuals are something that we should also incorporate. You would be fascinated to know that before industrial psychology came into picture in the West, it had already been established in traditional India. In the Vedas and in epic literature of Hinduism, it was noted that there were a lot of principles in industrial psychology that were primarily present in these epic literature and Vedic literature. So there was mention of that work is worship. One's salvation can only be achieved by great work. And this is something that is emphasized in industrial psychology. So we can see that traditional psychology in India had a lot of strong basis in the roots of Indian history. Okay, you would be fascinated to know that the psychology was first introduced in Department of Philosophy in Calcutta University in 1916. So always remember, it was during 1916 in Calcutta University, and psychology did not have a department of its own. It was in philosophy's department where psychology came. So Calcutta was a prime city at that point of time where psychology boomed in India. After that, independent psychology departments started being developed across India, but that was only after independence was achieved. So once post-independence and during early years, psychology had started emerging as an independent department in universities across India. And it was also seen that during early years, there was a lot of relevance which was given to experimental psychology. So over here, the aim was to promote, advance, and spread the knowledge of psychology in the Indian context. And to do this, Indian Psychological Association was further established in 1924. And following this, we had the Indian Journal of Psychology after in 1925. So in 1924, we had IPA, Indian Psychological Association, and in 1925, we had Indian Journal of Psychology. Okay. Moreover, in late 40s, applied psychology had gained more importance in India in comparison to our experimental psychology. So psychology was being applied in the lives of people to change certain behavior, to modify behavior, right? So psychology in traditional India had a huge history, and the basis this further was revolutionized. So when the subject was introduced, and we can see that when it became modern in the current century, the development of modern psychology in India is often seen from theories that were primarily developed to explain concepts such as sensation and perceptions. So Indian psychologists such as J. Sinha wrote a great book on Indian theories of perception. So it allowed us to understand the cultural relevance of these fundamental processes. So similar to Western psychologists, India also had psychologists where they started looking at cognition, and Jadunath Sinha in 1958 wrote a book on cognition, and later on he worked up upon emotions. And now we can see there are works such as Oriental psychology, Buddhist psychology, yoga psychology, Jain psychology, which are a great part of modern psychological literature. Okay, and this is particularly a lot of, we can say, Western based psychometric tools have further been adapted to India, and they have been made sure or developed in such a way that there is cultural relevance. Now, when we talk about traditional and modern psychology in India, traditional psychology had basis in our Vedas and epic literature, but modern psychology had basis in science as well as the epic literature, as well as learnings from Western psychology. So there were prime psychologists, one I had already mentioned, J. Sinha, who had made sure this, wave of psychology occurs. Apart from that, why do you think it is important to learn psychology in India, in the sense that how this dramatic change occur? Think about it, that every culture, when we talk about cultural psychology, social psychology, they behave differently. People in the culture behave differently. There are social norms, societal norms, cultural norms, right, who determine our behavior. This is why it is important to study psychology in relevance to culture. So there are currently, if you can search this book, it's Modern India Psychology by Rao. So this is a great book that gives you immense insight in how modern psychology in India took place, the relevance of psychology in the Indian culture, as well as for Indian citizens. You can see that a test being standardized is really important. Why is that? Because if a test is not standardized, let's say a test has been standardized in the West, okay, and it's an identification test, right, where you have to look at faces and identify them, and let's say it checks your memory. Okay, so what would happen now? It has not been standardized for Indian population, and you are doing this test, and it has faces of foreign people or American or European people. The problem would be that I, as an Indian, or you as an Indian, would have to pay more attention to it. So it might not assess the exact fundamental process that we are trying to. Okay, so this is why changing the course of research and administration of tools in India was important. With this, we have come to an end for our today's lesson. I hope you all enjoyed learning the wide scope, and I feel like it has definitely given you some insight on the career path that you can choose for yourself as well, right? So doing a quick recap, we learned about nature of psychology. So what is nature of psychology? So yes, nature of psychology is primarily concerned with understanding the behavior, understanding the fundamental processes, how the field developed, how it was divided. And through the division, we learned about early divisions of psychology, which included our experimental branch of psychology and non-experimental branch of psychology. And we learned about the scope of psychology, which means how far the field of psychology goes through subfields of psychology. So there were a total of 23 fields that we learned about, right? And lastly, we learned psychology in India and different models. Okay, so this was something that we learned, how traditional psychology was there and how modern psychology was there in relation to the Indian cultural context, and how research took place, and how standardization of certain tools and assessments in the field of psychology happened to fit the Indian population. Okay, so with this we end our today's lesson, but before we go, a quick discussion round. So one thing that I would like to ask you is, what do you think are the tasks of a psychologist? If this question comes, how would we answer it? So what would be an ideal task of a psychologist? What do you think it can be? So a psychologist is concerned with different tasks, from assessment, application of theories, bringing systematic community change, treatment, counseling, and research. So psychologist has different tasks depending on the field they are working in. So every psychologist in different field would have a different task. Okay, so this is a small homework for you all to go ahead and try to learn more about different tasks performed in each of these fields of psychologists. All right, next is, what are the two early divisions of psychology? What were the two early divisions? Think about it. Yes, non-experimental branch and experimental branch. Experimental branch focused with research of fundamental processes, whereas non-experimental branch focused with personality, social, and developmental processes. Yes. Next is, what are the distinctions between traditional and modern psychology in India? So traditional psychology was based on your Vedas and epic literature, whereas modern psychology in India was based on your Western psychology, Vedic literature, and applying those Western processes as well as the theories that were there in an Indian context. Apart from that, when was the first psychology department or psychology as a subject was introduced? Where? In Calcutta University, correct? Lastly, a very broad question that can come in your question paper is, what is the nature and scope of psychology? So we know that scope of psychology is very wide. So how will you write this answer? First, you will introduce psychology. You will talk about different definitions that are in the field of psychology as well as the current definition. Then you will talk about the basic principles and divisions of psychology. And when you have to discuss scope, you will discuss it in the context of 23 subfields. So you can say that the psychology has a wide scope because it's spread across different fields in the world. So we have our ergonomics, industrial psychology, social psychology, clinical psychology. So make sure you give an example and explain each, and you write about each one of them. So describe what it is, give an example, give the role of psychologist over there, and then move ahead. Okay. So with this, we have come to the end of our lesson for today, and I hope you had some good learning. I will suggest you to go ahead and read as well about it, so you can further understand the different elements about whatever we have learned. Make sure to write those discussion points and address it properly. Okay, so I will see you in the next lesson. Until then, happy learning all.